Now we are on chapter 32. So we left off again with Gerda and Fritz finding or nicking like a pipe under in the tunnel and them having to fix it. And Gerda basically had to stand there for a while to make sure that they didn't get any more water in there. So they're really coming across a lot of issues and problems trying to get this tunnel finished. So this is chapter 32. With the mud and standing water, there was nothing more we could do in the tunnel that day. I suggested working on the garden beneath the warming sun, but after we got into the light and saw each other and how filthy we were, we abandoned the idea of doing anything. We took a quick swim in the pond and let ourselves dry off somewhat before walking home. And we checked for Frau Eberhardt around each corner before rounding it. I couldn't even imagine the questions she'd have for us tonight, especially if she noticed the cut in my arm. Despite our appearances, it was an uneventful walk home. The people who did see us were used to us being dirty and understood we were working on a garden, so they barely noticed that we were dirtier than usual. But once we got inside our apartment, something was different. Fritz and Gerda Lowe, I want explanations. Mama had come home. My first thought was for the hidden microphones. Mama had been gone for a few weeks to a place where she didn't have to think about them. Hopefully she remembered that was always a concern here. Every word we said mattered, and the way we said it mattered just as much. My second thought was for what Mama must be thinking as she stared at Fritz and I. Nothing about us looked good. Beneath the layers of dirt, we were too thin, and our clothes were soiled and ragged. I had become deeply tanned, and my hands and knees were calloused. In only 3 weeks, we had gone from being respectable young people to looking more like workhouse orphans. Fritz smiled warmly, walked forward, and gave Mama a kiss on the cheek. I thought I saw him whisper into her ear when he did, but it was so quiet that I couldn't be sure. I walked forward next and wanted more than anything to hug her, but she was clean, so I only reached up to kiss her too. When I did, she grabbed my arm and saw the long cut from the rock. "What?" she started to ask. "It's just a scratch," I told her, for the microphones. "From a weed. We've been gardening. It was supposed to be a surprise for you." Mama was surprised, all right. She pursed her lips together and then told us both to get washed up. Fritz allowed me the first bath, and I took my time. Better here than anywhere near Mama's temper. When the water got cold enough for me to force me out, I could have sworn more dirt than water ran down the drain. When I got into the front room, I expected to see Fritz beside a fire, having written out explanations to Mama, and then everything would be better, but it was too warm outside to justify a fire without creating suspicion. Mama clearly knew we were up to something bigger than gardening, yet we couldn't freely talk about any of it. When Fritz went to bathe, I asked Mama about Oma Gertrude. I figured that was safe. Oma's well enough to get around now, but she'll have a cast for several more weeks. She misses you both and wondered why you didn't come with me. Where's all of our food? Mama had been poking around the kitchen. There were some things, a cup of flour, half a bottle of vinegar, some sausage grease, and something far in the back of the refrigerator that neither Fritz or I recognized. "We haven't had time for the store," I said. Mama opened her mouth, closed it, and then marched over to the table where she began unpacking a bag. Oma Gertrude insisted on sending me home with food. Some things are easier to buy out in the country, and she wanted me to bring them back to you. While I'm cooking, go to your room, Gerda, and get it cleaned up. You could probably garden in there with how dirty it is. Yes, Mama. Less than an hour later, warm, wonderful smells began coming from the kitchen. Sausage and potatoes and biscuits. Whatever Oma Gertrude had sent back with my mother, I loved them both all the more for it. Fritz and I didn't need to be called for supper. We were both in our places at the table when Mama served it. Food had never tasted so good. I ate greedily and remembered my manners only when I caught a glimpse of Mama's disapproving stare. "The two of you had turned to savages," she muttered, "and someone had better tell me where all the sheets in the home have gone." Mama didn't sound angry yet, but she probably hadn't noticed the missing hinges on our coat closet door either. Fritz and I had a lot of explaining to do. We invited her for a walk around the neighborhood that night. We kept ourselves as far as possible from any crowds, and then our story started to unfold. We started with the picture of the welcome building that Papa had sent. Mama said my father knew it well. During the war, it had been a clothing shop where his mother used to work. As I had suspected, he had sometimes hidden in the air raid shelter of that basement when the sirens went off. "We need to tell you about that shelter," Fritz said. We started with the easier part first, about the garden on the surface and about the clothesline set up for me to do laundry. "You'd wash my sheets in a pond?" Mother had always prided herself on her laundry. "Gerda, that ruins them." "Well, they're ruined now, Mama, all of them." I took a deep breath. "But we needed an excuse to be at the pond, so we could dump the dirt." "Dump what dirt?" Fritz took her hand, and in that moment I was glad that he was the older brother that was telling her this. He leaned into her and very quietly said, "The dirt from our tunnel beneath the wall." To her credit, Mama took the news better than we had expected. She didn't yell or faint, neither of which would have surprised me, but it took her a long time to start breathing again, and when she did, it was loud, shallow gasps. She shook her head in disbelief and let Fritz hold her shoulders to keep her calm. "What have you done?" she whispered. "Oh, my children, why would you do this?" As the reality of our confession sank in, she pulled us into a quiet alleyway and faced each of us with horror in her eyes. I hated seeing that expression from my mother. It was one thing to see fear from Fritz or to feel it myself, but we had handled our fear and we were managing our troubles as they came. To see so much worry from Mama was something else entirely. It meant that maybe everything wasn't as safe as we had let ourselves believe. "What will happen when the tunnel is found?" she whispered. "Because it will be. They always are." "Well, we'll be gone by then," Fritz said. "How do you know? You're working in the shadow of the wall. Do you think the guards aren't watching you, aren't curious about what you're doing? A garden is a nice excuse, and maybe they'll ignore it, but for how long?" We hadn't told her about Officer Mueller, nor did we intend to. If she knew that one of the Grenzers had already discovered us, it would only strengthen her argument. "Papa wanted us to dig," I said. "Your father would have never have asked this," Mama said. "No matter how much he misses us, he would never put us at risk." "But he did," I insisted. "I saw him." "Enough of the nonsense. Starting tomorrow, you will bury up the hole and all the tools, and you will abandon the garden, and Fritz, you will find a job until you join the military." "I can't get a job, or any job," Fritz hissed, "and I won't join the military. What's done is done. Our only choice now is to leave." "What about Oma Gertrude? Who would take care of her?" I felt awful for having forgotten about my grandmother. We couldn't leave her behind, of course, and with a broken leg, she couldn't make the walk through an uneven, narrow tunnel. "I never understood the way your father thought, and I don't understand it in you two either." Mama was shaking her head. "We have an okay life here." "No, Mama, we don't. So much of what we tolerate is wrong. Even if nobody wants to think about it, we can't keep living this way." "But at least we will live. It's what your father would have wanted." "Don't talk about him as if he's dead." My words came out as sharp as if I'd yelled them. "I know what Papa wanted, for all of us to come to the West with him that night, and you said no. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have to build a tunnel, and we'd be safe and together. This is your fault." "Gerda, that's enough." For a moment, Fritz's tone had sounded the way I remembered my father's voice, and I thought about how disappointed Papa would be if he had heard me speak so rudely to my mother. "I'm sorry," I whispered to her. "It's not true." "Well, some of it is," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry for that I wasn't brave when I needed to be." Mama's face seemed to have aged years during this conversation. I felt older too, as if things I had spent so much time thinking about were light years away from what other girls my age were doing. I no longer cared about dolls or dresses or even smuggled Beatles records. What a silly rebellion that was compared to my actions now. Near treason in the eyes of the government. "We'll take you to the tunnel tomorrow," I said. "You'll see. Only if it's dried out by then," Fritz reminded me. "It got a lot of water today." He shouldn't have said that. Mama's back stiffened, and I knew she was picturing Fritz and me swimming for our lives. That hardly helped our case. "Let's go." Mama shook off a shiver that ran through the length of her. "I feel exposed out here. We're safer at home." But as we neared our apartment, I doubted that was true. Stasi vehicles were in front of our building with armed officers in the street. Mama instinctively got us behind her while Fritz and I looked at each other. My heart lurched into my throat. Were they here for us? "Oma Gertrude gave me her car," Mama said cautiously. "There's not much gas left, but we'll go as far as we can. I parked it in a lot behind us. You and Fritz go inside the apartment and hide on the floor. I left the keys on the table upstairs. I'll come back for you soon." "No, Mom." Fritz put a hand on her shoulder to guide her away with us. If they're here to arrest Gerda and me, then they'll arrest you too." Before we could act, a woman's screams caught our attention. Stasi officers were leading her outside in handcuffs. I immediately recognized her as the beautiful woman I had seen the night I stole the Poli. She was trying to fight with the officers, but when she got to the street, I saw the crowd. She yelled, "It's no crime to think or to speak or to be me." They were nearly the same words that had been on Herrkraus's handmade stamped papers. Even after being arrested, Herr Kraus must have found another way to get his message out. Maybe with small meetings in his apartment, like those he used to hold with my father. Herr Kraus was brought out again, but this time his body was on a gurney and perfectly still. And since Stasi officers were carrying him out, I figured it was safe to assume his death was not an accident. Herr Kraus had received his punishment for daring to think and for getting others to think too. Sadness stabbed at my gut for how wrong this was, how unfair. Yet I couldn't cry. I wanted to, but in that moment, fear was overwhelming every other sense in me. Whatever crimes Herr Kraus had committed, it was safe to assume that Fritz and I had done far worse. If we couldn't get Mama to change her mind, soon we would face Herr Kraus's punishment too.